Aristoteles, Putin will lose, yes, why? Is about the Ukrainian-Russian attack. I think the attack already happened, the invasion, I mean. Yes, already exploded.
Why are you doing this? Why are you fighting this needless war?
Putin will probably watch this
That will
video.
topple so many lives. He sent his forces, his missiles, in the middle of the night. These are the troops, hundreds of thousands of them, that had been camped out on the border for months.
Camping.
Troops that Putin had insisted were there for a routine military exercise, and that the US and UK intel swore were actually preparing to invade. Many around the world, including in Ukraine, thought that this was just the West being dramatic, stoking the tensions.
Probably not.
But the intel was exactly right. Most of those troops crossed the border last week and are now inside the country.
What?
Russian military vehicles,
Probably
including tanks, entering
news.
Ukraine.
The invasion, the attack that Russia promised would never happen, has now started.
On Crimea too.
Hours after this invasion started in the middle of the night on Thursday morning, Ukraine's President Zelensky appeared on TV, not just to talk to his people, but to speak directly to Russians themselves.
Я обращаюсь к российским гражданам как гражданин Украины.
We share a border of over 2,000 kilometers, and along this border, your troops are stationed.
Maybe the people of Russia can
200,000
help.
soldiers. Your leaders just approved them to make a step towards us, into the territory of another country.
I think Putin makes a
This
decision, right?
step is likely the beginning of a massive war on the European continent.
Russia again warned its nuclear forces were on high alert.
Several cities were hit in residential areas, resulting in dozens of civilian deaths.
This is a war
the
unlike
deaths.
any war the world has ever seen. It looks like a war from like 1830, but it's happening in 2022. Putin's army is much stronger than
Was that rocket
Ukraine's,
launcher?
at least in terms of numbers. If he really wants to, he probably is going to be able to take over the country's major population centers and oust the Ukrainian government. The US and NATO can't send troops for fear of starting a clash between two nuclear nations, something we simply do not do. It's a red line that no one crosses. I want to tell you exactly why Vladimir Putin and his army are here. The story behind this invasion is the story of this one man's worldview, but it's also a story of a bet that he took, a bet that Ukrainians would give up, lay down their arms, and see the world the way he does. But if there's anything I have learned in the past week, it's that even if Putin conquers a big portion of this country, something he has the military hardware to do, even if he does that, he still won't win this war. In fact, I'm here to argue that he's already lost.
There are
Already.
explosions taking place in Kiev.
It's because of the communism
People here are going
airlines.
to be waking up to a very different country than the one they went to sleep in.
We are getting just non-stop reports of attacks and Russian strikes from all across the country.
Vladimir Putin has already lost this war. And to understand what I'm talking about, you have to look at two things. Number one, what Putin said right before the invasion. And number two, what actually happened
What does he
once he
say?
invaded. I want to show you both. So a few days before the invasion, Putin gets on TV and addresses the nation.
Уважаемые граждане России, дорогие друзья,
It's this unsurprising hour-long history lecture where Putin lays out his grand, intricate argument as to why Ukraine, in fact, isn't a real country.
Итак, начну с того, что современная Украина целиком и полностью была создана Россией.
Instead, Ukraine was created by the authors of the Russian Communist Revolution 100 years ago. And now Ukraine, this invented country that's just an extension of Russia itself, has been hijacked by the US and Europe, who have installed neo-Nazi thugs to run the show. Seriously, he said all of this. You can go watch the hour-long lecture if you want. According to his story, the West did this to eventually force Ukraine into their military alliance called NATO, which they will use to defeat Russia. Just like, and seriously he says this, just like Hitler did 80 years ago. But this time, Putin will make sure that Russia is ready for the invasion.
What is this argument?
Oh gosh, there is a lot to unpack here. The neo-Nazi thug thing, I will get to that in a second. But the message was clear. Putin was basically like, Ukraine, if you're going to disavow communist Russia and all of the things that it gave to you, you don't deserve the land that you got from communist Russia. And in fact, all of this land still belongs to Russia, and we're going to take it back.
Вы хотите декоммунизации? Ну что же, нас это вполне устраивает. Но не нужно, что называется, останавливаться на полпути. Мы готовы показать вам, что значит для Украины настоящая декоммунизация.
But this warped historical framing of who rightfully owns this land isn't quite enough to justify an invasion, maybe in like 1860 or something, but not today. So Putin needs to really emphasize the villains in his story. So he makes a big part of his story this idea that Ukraine, this fake country, is being run by American-backed anti-Russian neo-Nazis who are holding the Ukrainian people hostage.
Неудивительно, что украинское общество столкнулось с ростом крайнего национализма, который быстро приобрел форму агрессивной русофобии и неонацизма.
Okay. It's easy to poke fun at like the delusion of Vladimir Putin, but let's talk about the facts here and what Putin is actually basing this off of, because it really matters for understanding why he went in and why he's going to lose. First, let's just clear up the fact that Ukraine wasn't invented by Russia. Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, was a thriving city long before Moscow was even on the map. Ukraine has a very old culture. But what Putin has done is twisted modern history to make a claim that Ukraine actually isn't a legitimate country. And he does this because it's a very key part of his story, one that supports the second major argument, which is that Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis who want to exterminate the Russian-speaking population. So let's get the facts here. Within Ukraine, there is indeed a faction of far-right neo-Nazis who have a political party and a militia force. And this militia force has actually joined the Ukrainian army in the past 8 years to fight Russia back from annexing any more territory in the east of the country. You may have remembered that Russia took over a big part of Ukraine called Crimea 8 years ago.
Ukrainian forces have set up a perimeter, but it's clear that we are completely surrounded by Russian forces.
Yeah, these neo-Nazi fighters, sort of nationalist guys, came up as a resistance to that. And yeah, Putin's got one thing right. These are not good people. These are literal neo-Nazi white supremacist soldiers that commit all sorts of atrocities and train children in their ideology and fighting tactics. So yeah, Putin, I get it. These are bad people, neo-Nazis. We don't like them. But Putin is claiming that these are the people running the country, running Ukraine. When in fact, if you look at the data from the 2019 election in Ukraine, you'll see that the country's ultra-nationalist far-right coalition gained barely over 2% of the vote and 0 seats in the parliament. They are a small group of extremely fringe far-right fighters that Putin has latched onto. Oh, and there's a more obvious bit of data here, which is that the Ukrainian president is Jewish and has family who died in the Holocaust. Ukraine is not run by neo-Nazis. Listen, to balance my view on this, because I'm in the West and I'm getting all Western media, I have actually been watching Russian state TV to like see what the narrative is on their side. And I can tell you that they actually believe that the country is run by Nazis.
It is reminiscent of the practices and methods of
Nazi Germany.
And we're seeing a full revival of Nazism and fascism in Ukraine.
I've tried to dig into this to try to understand, like, is there more like meat on the bone here? No, there's not. A fringe group of militiamen in the Far East are what Putin is basing this off of. Over here in reality land, Ukraine is a nation of 44 million people with its own culture that is thousands of years old. It is a country where fewer and fewer people like Russia. In fact, it's a country that ousted the pro-Russian leader in 2014. The people don't want Russia and Putin anymore. They've moved on. But all of these facts are explained away very conveniently by Putin's bigger conspiracy, which is that it's actually outside forces that are pulling the strings, and that the people of Ukraine have been brainwashed by the West. And yet there is one thing that Putin is absolutely right about.
Это наши товарищи, близкие, среди которых не только коллеги, друзья, бывшие сослуживцы, но и родственники. Люди, связанные с нами кровными семьями.
These two countries are deeply connected through culture and language and history and exchange. A war against Ukrainians would not sit well with the Russian people. And this explains why Putin needs to frame the war in a very certain way. Not an invasion to take over a sovereign nation of Russia's brothers and sisters, but rather a rescue effort to save the Ukrainian people from these aggressive villains who are really controlling the country.
В курсе ли всех этих управленческих методов сами украинцы? Понимают ли, что их страна находится даже не под политическим и экономическим протекторатом, а сведена до уровня колонии с марионеточным режимом?
Okay, I'm about to jump into the maps and look at how the war is actually playing out to help us understand it. But I really, really want us to keep in mind Putin's story, because it really will make everything click. So let's just go over it really quickly. Putin's story is really four things. Number one, Ukraine really belongs to Russia. Number two, it has been hijacked by the US and Europe, i.e. the West. Number three, the West is controlling Ukraine with its neo-Nazi puppets, also that the West military alliance NATO can use Ukraine as a bridge to get to Russia, who they want to defeat. And all of this leads to Putin must invade to free Ukrainians and protect Russia from the West. That is it. That is the justification that Vladimir Putin has been building for years, if not decades.
Повторю, наши действия — это самозащита от создаваемых нам угроз и от еще большей беды, чем та, что происходит сегодня.
Minutes after this second address last week, where he laid out all of his justifications, in the middle of the night, the rockets start flying and the tanks start rolling.
Oh boy. It's an actual war.
This is how it started. What is becoming the most consequential war in Europe since World War II. A pretend rescue effort framed as an operation to denazify the country.
Pretend rescue?
Russia comes in from all sides, quickly taking over mostly rural areas, but slowly moving towards the major cities.
The country is being attacked from all directions. Some of those Russian troops are heading here to the capital.
In addition to tanks and troops taking over land, Russia also starts firing missiles that hit targets all throughout the country.
This has come out of nowhere. Who resist? Oh, I tell you what, I just heard a big bang right here.
Yes.
The invasion, the attack that Russia promised would never happen, has now started.
What is going on?
People who live in Kyiv are sleeping in underground subway stations. It's the only place they feel safe.
Ukrainians fled to basements, to bomb shelters.
Some people are adjusting to this new reality of living in a country now at war.
Hundreds of thousands fled to the borders west of the country, looking for safety.
Others are taking trains to the west to get out of the country.
They are fleeing into neighboring countries like Moldova, Romania, and Poland.
At the city's central train station, a frantic dash as people try to escape to the west of the country.
But wait, remember Putin's story? According to this story, after this initial invasion, Ukrainians were going to wake up from their slumber and welcome him with open arms. The neo-Nazi president was going to flee, and Ukraine would be returned to Russia, Putin becoming the savior of the Russian motherland. But that is exactly what didn't happen.
Outgunned and outnumbered, Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike are mounting a stiff resistance.
I used to teach maths and physics, but 2 days ago, the Russian army took control of my town, so I signed up to fight.
Every day, Ukrainians are taking to the streets to fight for their homeland.
Let those Russian ships come here, she says. We are ready to greet them.
We are ready to fight. and like fight like hell.
This is my city. This is my land. I have to protect it.
You do not feel that they're going to succeed in taking out your administration and your government?
No way. They will never take Kiev.
The response of Ukrainians, both military and civilian, is where Putin's story starts to crumble.
The entire world is witnessing the determined and brave resistance by the Ukrainian army and population.
I have never seen Ukraine that united.
And as for the president of Ukraine, the alleged neo-Nazi drug addict thug puppet of the West, well, the US actually offered to airlift him out of the country for his own safety. Instead of taking the offer, his response was, quote, "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride." Which, by the way, that quote has been turned into a t-shirt that you can buy on Amazon.
Ukrainians are fighting for love of country. Russians are fighting out of a fear of the dictator.
In the event of Russia opting for escalation, Ukraine will defend itself.
He then sent a video around to the country of him in central Kiev, making it known that he is staying, he is fighting. So despite being totally outmatched militarily, Ukrainians are fighting back, showing that the outcome of a war is as much determined by the courage and patriotism of the population as it is by the number of missiles and troops that you have.
Будут наступать войска, если у нас попытаются отнять нашу страну, нашу свободу, наши жизни, жизни наших детей, мы будем защищаться. Не наступать, защищаться. Наступая, вы будете видеть наши лица, не наши спины, наши лица.
I've been talking to people inside Ukraine and seeing this devotion firsthand.
How is morale right now among you and among the people you're talking to? Honestly, extremely high.
Ukrainians aren't letting this conquest happen, and in doing so, they are turning Putin's argument, his story, on its head, and foiling what appears to be his initial strategy for wrangling Ukraine back into his sphere of influence. One Ukrainian I talked to said that there's a waiting list for the Ukrainian army.
Our regional defense won't accept any more people because it's packed.
The queues are growing.
And you cannot even get in right now.
Men volunteering to fight.
Molotov cocktails for those who want to fight.
Want to fight,
don't have a gun.
A tweet from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry to prepare Molotov cocktails to throw at the occupiers.
I'm here in order to protect my family, my country.
There is
a tutorial
sense of unity here. The morale is very high.
Okay, this sounds all positive, and it is, but this is still war, and Putin can still conquer a lot of land. He can take over major cities, install a puppet government, and be the new ruler of Ukraine. He has the military to do it, and he seems to have the tolerance for bloodshed. He seems to believe in his fantasy story so much that he's going to keep up this crusade. But I'm here to tell you that Putin has already lost this war. I mean, let's play this out so I can show you what I mean. Let's say Putin keeps going. He keeps sending troops in and missiles despite all of this resistance. He could eventually take over the major population centers, including the capital Kiev. All of this with the same goal that he's had the whole time, which is getting the Ukrainians to give up and realize that Russia is actually the country they want to align with. He's also kind of hoping that maybe the Ukrainian military will come to their senses and take over the government and negotiate with Putin. But let's say they never do, they probably won't. Instead, they keep doing what they've been doing for the last week, resisting, defending, condemning, and broadcasting all of it to the world on the internet. So Putin has no choice but to drive the government out and install a pro-Russian regime. In order to do this, he's going to need a massive military presence to keep control of these cities and their people. It's now costing him tens of billions of dollars and crippling his economy, which, by the way, is only like the size of Texas. I mean, one of the biggest knocks on Putin's plan is the sheer size of Ukraine. Let's zoom out and realize that Ukraine is huge. It's the biggest country in Europe, if you don't count Russia, the giant country that extends into Asia. Occupying this entire landmass would be basically impossible for Russia. So you have a map that maybe looks something like this, which gives plenty of space for Ukrainians to gather and mount their resistance, giving Russia hell for an indefinite period of time. Meanwhile, back home in Russia, they've now seen the imagery from the ground. They now see that
Probably
Putin's
lost
story
billions of
justifying this
dollars.
invasion is total BS. There's no Nazis, there's no brainwashing of the people. Instead, in this scenario, Russians are thinking of deaths of our Ukrainian brothers and sisters, while also destroying the Russian economy.
Almost every Russian has someone from Ukraine, either a friend or a relative or a colleague. This is a war between brother nations.
Protesters in the streets demonstrating against Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
On top of all of that, the rich Russian business guys who keep Putin in power, the oligarchs, they aren't happy because the entire world has cut Russia off.
Russian billionaires moving their yachts,
okay.
scrambling their jets, and shifting their assets to prepare for a
The economy is going down.
They can't access their financial reserves. Their ability to move money is made much more difficult. People aren't letting their trade vessels into ports.
New efforts by U.S. law enforcement to make Russian oligarchs feel the pain of Putin's war.
I mean, this is effectively what sanctions do. So the oligarchs are now like, dude, Putin, WTF? And they put pressure on him to stop this madness. But even still, Putin has enough power that he could still dig in his heels and keep trying to get Ukrainians to come under his rule. But by this point, Ukrainians are done with Putin. They see his true colors. Anyone who was on the fence before has now witnessed civilians being killed in Putin's war of choice. They won't come on his side now. The upshot here is that there's not really a scenario where Putin keeps going and gets what he wants. And that's because the story that he based this invasion off of is proving to be totally wrong. All of these assumptions that he predicated his war on turned out to be the delusions of a pseudo-history buff stuck in the logic of the Cold War, not the realities on the ground today. Add another point to the against Putin camp. Meanwhile, Putin's war has united the West and NATO like never before. NATO has a new sense of purpose, a new thing to rally around, something they've been looking for since the end of the Cold War. And Ukraine, who is currently getting tons of support and weapons and money and aid and refugee support from NATO countries, is now way more likely to sympathize with the West. Because now they've seen the realities of what Putin has to offer, which is falsehoods and unprovoked conflict, all in the name of some ill-defined vision of former imperial glory. Nope.
It's my city, it's my hometown, it's my homeland, it's my country, and I'm not the one who should live. The Russians are the one who should live. Russia is a great nation, full of beautiful culture, geography, history, and people. The vast majority of those people don't want imperial-style expansion and war. They want to live their lives, prosper, to connect. And yet, the world's delusional worldview of one greedy man has cut off their ability to do that. How is that possible?
The Russian people have no say in the behavior of their government under the Putin dictatorship.
It's incredibly
dictatorship.
Often young people in Russia who are out on the streets protesting against what their president is doing.
This is not the war by the people of Russia. This is yet another military adventure by the unaccountable, unelected, increasingly deranged dictator in the Kremlin by the name of Vladimir Putin.
This situation is developing and certainly will take paths that no one can predict. By the time you're watching this, I'm sure some key development has happened that I haven't covered here. But I feel pretty certain when I say that Putin really doesn't have a path to the victory that he set out to achieve last week when he sent people and weapons across his border to attack his neighbors. Ukrainians, with their bold courage, have proved him wrong. I know that sounds very poetic and maybe even cliche, but in this case, it's true.
If someone told me a week ago I would own an assault rifle, I would not believe.
So now the world will stand by and support as they continue to wage this battle for the future of their land that belongs to them, not to a Russian dictator.
Just for
How long is he in control?
It's our home.
Putin.
We will defend it.
13 Ukrainian border guards defiantly telling an invading Russian warship to go F
Probably
yourself.
new leader.
And we will win. Russian ship, go fuck yourself. Slava Ukraini.
Okay, before you go, I want to give money to the relief effort in Ukraine. There's a lot of need right now. I'm running a fundraiser where I'm going to match donations up to $10,000. Information in the description.
Cool.
Number 2, I need to thank
giving
today's
to
sponsor
Ukrainian.
who made this video possible. Thank you, NordVPN.
These people is giving donations, setting up a fundraiser. He's getting out of control right there. Hopefully he will come to senses and end the war, or rather end the invasion. It's absolutely mind-boggling how he came to that. Russia probably needs a good new leader and how to get out of dictatorship too. Anyway, video,